Hi again, and welcome back to Platonic Soul, and I hope you've been well. So, how might Platonic love, the real teaching on love by Plato and his followers, actually improve your life? If you've been following this series so far, you might remember that I promised at the very beginning to answer that question. And then I talked about self-dividedness being this fundamental and universal human problem, and how neither religion nor science have been able to really solve that problem, at least not on their own, not entirely, or not to the satisfaction of many of us today. At least neither religion or science, perhaps, as conventionally understood. Although I think, in a way, it's sort of the unspoken goal, perhaps, of Platonism to be a kind of science of the good that, in a way, brings these two things together or transcends the difference between them or bridges them in some way. Anyway, more recently, I've been talking about what we could call Plato's theoretical solution to this problem of human self-dividedness, of the sense that our psyche is divided into rational and irrational parts, and how the psyche actually has the potential to be at one with itself by raising to consciousness this kind of latent or unconscious knowledge that it has of the unity of being. A solution that I'm not sure has been entirely appreciated, or at least not widely appreciated. The problem, of course, is that it's one thing to be given a theoretical solution, but this won't help us much until we know how to realize it. How exactly do we go about raising this knowledge to consciousness, and how will this actually improve our lives? And this is what I'll be mostly talking about in the rest of this series. And the first thing I want to put forth in that regard is this idea that actually I'm not sure the theoretical and the practical really do just neatly divide. Perhaps especially not in this philosophy. What I mean is that already in our very grasping of Plato's solution to human self-division, it does, or at least certainly can, start its work on us, on healing and growing us from within. And here's what I mean by this. Plato speaks more than once about the work of philosophy being a transformation or turning around, not just of the mind, that part of us that moves in abstraction or through abstractions, but of the whole self. And so it's clear that for Plato, the improvement of life that philosophy brings about must be accompanied by some kind of activity of that part of the self that moves in the realm of non-abstract or immediate cognition. Simply put, you could say, that part of us that feels. And I think it's not uncommon for this instant in which we glimpse the Platonic solution that I've been talking about to be accompanied by an emotional response in a way that we're not likely to see, for example, when presented with the solution to a mathematical or purely logical problem. And this is because I'm not sure it's really possible to glimpse this solution without some accompanying glimpse into the implications of this solution for our own individual lives. Implications, I think, that present themselves to us, perhaps not always consciously in a thought-out way, but whose existence make themselves felt to us through emotion. This has to do with what I've often referred to as the deeply subversive character of the Platonic solution. And I mean subversive, not politically, of course, but on the most basic level, psychically. I've spoken before about the tendency for us all to accumulate, as we grow up and live our lives, a kind of fatalistic sense of being by nature divided into these rational and irrational parts, and the kind of quiet despair that accompanies this sense of self-dividedness, a despair that sort of sits in the background of life or of consciousness, but affects us nonetheless, perhaps as a sense of the world being disenchanted, of a child's sense of wonder being lost, or of our not feeling fully alive, or of feeling somehow numb. And I've talked about this in Proust, but of course, we also see this theme in popular culture in all kinds of ways. In the words, just to cite one example of this Pink Floyd song, Comfortably Numb. When I was a child, I caught a fleeting glimpse out of the corner of my eye. I turned to look, but it was gone. I cannot put my finger on it now. The child is grown, the dream is gone, and I have become comfortably numb. And perhaps this fear of being, in some sense, not fully alive is sometimes externalized in popular culture. In the zombie movie genre, for instance, a fear, you might say, of the walking dead, or of becoming one of the walking dead. Anyway, I think there's more tension than there may appear behind this sense of numbness. And the reason why the Platonic solution can be emotionally powerful is that it releases this tension by presenting a solution to the fatalistic assumption of self-dividedness that fuels this tension. What I'm talking about, of course, is this Platonic idea of the dividedness of the psyche into these rational and irrational parts being, in some sense, illusory. That's really, I think, what Plato's telling us in this solution, in this philosophy of Platonic love. And that solution is rooted in what you could call Platonic metaphysics, although he wouldn't have recognized that word. The highest good is also the highest truth and the highest unity. The good is the principle of both truth and unity. And we never really see the good perfectly, but are always, in a way, kind of blindly grasping after it. And sometimes it appears to us as the true, and sometimes it appears to us as oneness, as unity. We are not, in fact, divided into rational and irrational parts. It would be truer to say that we experience the object of our desire sometimes as truth and sometimes as oneness. In our everyday lives, we often experience these two experiences of desire or objects of desire as rational and irrational, respectively. But they're in fact both aspects of the same desire, the only desire we have, which is desire for the good. And so, in fact, there's no real principle of human dividedness. This idea, for example, that Plato puts forth through much of the Republic, of the idea of soul as divided in its nature, into three parts actually, but one is rational and the other are sort of basically not rational. It's in some sense illusory, as Plato in fact himself suggests toward the very end of the Republic, where he talks about the difficulty of seeing the psyche in its true state, because human life has made it like the statue of the sea god Glaucus, with all these different deformations and encrustations. So yeah, I wonder if it's even possible for most of us to conceive this Platonic solution without some kind of emotional response, because I think the perhaps unconscious fatalistic idea of self-dividedness that I mentioned earlier must be accompanied by an also unconscious sort of writing off of a considerable part of our inner lives as necessarily irrational and meaningless. A writing off that is likely to make us feel superficially numb, perhaps, yes, but perhaps also on a deeper level that again may not be conscious to us, sorrowful and anxious. But then this Platonic, I'm not just me myself, but it's like I'm two, and which is even the real me? But then this Platonic vision comes along of the psyche being not divided, but fundamentally one in its desire for the good, which is both true and one, and only seems to be two different objects of desire. And it's a moment, I think, that can be quite dramatic because suddenly a way becomes open. It really quite dramatically shows itself, much as the writer of the seventh letter puts it, and probably Plato himself, a leaping spark kindles a blaze. There's a sudden kind of redemption here of every moment of life. All these moments which we had perhaps in unconscious sorrow written off because it's actually all meaningful. It's all for the good. And the good, in a sense, has been with us every step of the way. Love would never leave us alone, either in pleasure, pain, grief, fear, joy. And so perhaps we may begin to divest ourselves of the heaviness of fatalism. And this may come with a powerful combination of feelings. On the one hand, it might mean a new sense of hope or joy even about the world, about ourselves, about the possibility of new life. But it may also mean a new awareness of the grief that has been unconsciously afflicting us. Perhaps also a sorrow for the effect that our fatalism has had on our lives. Perhaps also even a fear to let go of this fatalism, because perhaps in a way it's been a certain guardrail for us. And I like to think that this is what Plato has in mind in the Phaedrus, when he speaks of the healing and growth of the wings of the psyche as painful. He talks about the wings of the soul, the existential hope and freedom of the psyche, as painfully bursting through the buds in which they've been encased. These buds representing, to my mind, the rigid assumptions about the world and ourselves that we unconsciously carry around with us as we make our way through our everyday lives. And so, what am I getting at here, you may ask? What's the connection between this emotional response and the healing and growth of the psyche that I mentioned earlier, that turning around of not just the mind, but the whole self that is so important to Plato? Well, something that I think is quite important, but I don't think has been sufficiently recognized in Plato, is this idea that there is somehow in human emotion or feeling, if you like, a kind of absolutely critical but inarticulate cognition, a kind of processing of the good takes place here unconsciously, without effort on our part. Of course, this might seem antithetical to the very idea of philosophy, which seems to us nowadays to move necessarily by means of these clear and distinct ideas only. But the Platonic philosophy is critically different in this respect from what we usually take philosophy to be in the modern West. I've just mentioned Plato's use of the metaphor in the Phaedrus of wing growth as a kind of illustration of this processing that is not, or at least not entirely conscious. A better metaphor would be that the conscious and the unconscious move in tandem to think through the good. And he's also spoken in that same dialogue, the Phaedrus, as we saw, of the psyche being a kind of seer, having access to a kind of, you could say, extra-rational knowledge. But there are other passages where he gives us a clearer idea of the kind of thing he has in mind. He talks, for example, both in the Republic and the Timaeus, and possibly other places, about how the psyche can be transformed without conscious effort through music, for example. Music, in the strict sense, perhaps especially, but I think we can understand also in that wider ancient Greek sense of art in general, the domain of the muses. In the Republic, Socrates says it is important for the young to be brought up exposed to the beautiful work of talented and inspired artists, so that they, quote, dwelling as it were in a salubrious region, may receive benefit from all things about them, whence the influence that emanates from works of beauty may waft itself to eye or ear like a breeze that brings from wholesome places health, and so from earliest childhood insensibly guide them to likeness, to friendship, to harmony with beautiful reason. So it's almost as though beauty just passes into the psyche by a kind of osmosis, or it can anyway. And then a bit later he says, education in music is most sovereign because more than anything else, rhythm and harmony find their way to the inmost soul and take strongest hold upon it, bringing with them and imparting grace if one is rightly trained, and otherwise the contrary. One who was properly educated in music, he says, would praise beautiful things and take delight in them and receive them into his soul to foster its growth and become himself beautiful and good. And as I just mentioned, the character Timaeus says something similar about music in the dialogue of the same name. In what is, to my mind, a crucial and fascinating passage later in that same dialogue, Timaeus goes on to explain how, as with art, so there's also an inarticulate or immediate cognition of the good and the true also in human feeling and the altered state of consciousness we have in dreaming. A kind of mystical glimpsing of it. He talks about the very lowest element of the human soul, that necessary for digestion and the other most basic functions of life, and locates it physically in the liver. He repeatedly states, or he ties it, it's connected to the liver. He repeatedly states, on the one hand, that this element of the psyche is devoid of rationality, and yet, at the same time, it is intimately connected with the mind in such a way as to reflect the mind's activity back to it once it has enriched it with its own unconscious processing. The immediate cognition that presents itself to us in our feelings and in our dreams, which Timaeus describes as a kind of bodily divination, a kind of unconscious processing that has the potential to then be brought to consciousness by the mind. And he says, for the authors of our being, remember the gods, remembering the command of their father when he bade them create the human race as good as they could, that they might correct our inferior parts and make them to attain a measure of the truth, placed in the liver the seed of divination. And herein is a proof that God has given the art of divination not to the wisdom, but to the foolishness of man. No man, when in his wits, attains prophetic truth and inspiration, but when he receives the inspired word, either his intelligence is enthralled in sleep, or he is demented by some distemper or possession. And he who would understand what he remembers to have been said, whether in a dream or when he was made by the prophetic and inspired nature, or when he was awake, by the prophetic and inspired, would understand what he remembers to have been said, whether in a dream or when he was awake, by the prophetic and inspired nature, or would determine by reason the meaning of the apparitions which he has seen, and what indications they afford to this man or that, of past, present, or future good and evil, must first recover his wits. But while he continues demented, he cannot judge of the visions which he sees or the words which he utters. The ancient saying is very true that, quote, only a man who has his wits can act or judge about himself and his own affairs, unquote. And for this reason, it is customary to appoint interpreters to be judges of the true inspiration. Some persons call them prophets, being blind to the fact that they are only the expositors of dark sayings and visions, and are not to be called prophets at all, but only interpreters of prophecy. And I guess today you could say these are the people maybe that we call psychoanalysts or therapists. Although I don't think, as I've mentioned before, one goal of this series is to show how we don't have in secular psychology the means to fully realize a better life for human nature. The fact is, though, that however heretical this may sound, for Plato, we are turned to, transformed by the good through, in a way, bodily processes, at least through what you could call a certain kind of bodily awareness, that the work of the mind is only part of the work of philosophy. If love or desire is for the good itself, and all human emotion is nothing other than refracted love or desire in all these different forms, eros that passes through the prism of life, then the entire range of human feeling must be telling us something, though not verbally, about the good. And so, yes, Platonic philosophy moves through abstract thinking, but not only. The other part of it, which is essential to it, has to do with an openness to the language of this other aspect of the self, the unconscious, or you could say irrational, or perhaps better, super-rational, a listening to it with a view to somehow decoding it. And yeah, the rest of this series, a lot of the rest of it will be to try to answer the question, well, how do we decode it? I know I said last time I'd be talking more about why Plato and those who follow in his tradition are so fond of sexual language when talking about human desire. But then I realized that for me to really talk about this, I would first need to talk about this inarticulate processing of the good that we have in human emotion first. And so, having now dealt with that, I aim to move on in the next episode to return to what we were talking about last time and maybe expand on it a little more. Anyway, I hope to see you then, and until then, be well, and thanks for watching.